Your bike's right there.
We are a pro rider. As a rider, this means you have to always put yourself in the limit. After classic season, cobbles on the North Europe, we have a kind of rest, and then we rebuild the shape with California, Tour de Suisse, and then the main goal is Tour de France.
We will be there with Peter. We will have 2 climbers with us for the GC, so I will support them as good as possible. And yeah, if there are opportunities for myself, I will try to grab them.
So there will be all our energy focus. With Peter will be maybe the goal will be still the green jersey on some stages for sure. And yeah, the tour is not easy, so we have to be prepared, and these 2 months are very important.
I'm hopefully in good shape, and I want to focus on stages, maybe from breakaway, harder stages, climbing, maybe also the time trials. I don't know yet.
I really love to push me at the limit, because it's kind of for myself is really challenging every year, every race, and I love it.
In this team, I found my spot. I got my chances, and it's the biggest bike race in the world. A lot of media attention. It's just huge what I heard, and I'm just curious to see how it feels to be part of it.
I start to see a lot of young guys coming up, and with strong legs and strong mind still, because Max is kind of guys like this.
I got a great coach, and it was easy to find my spot in the team. And yeah, pretty quick during the season, I got the full support of the team, and I'm happy that I could deliver quite a few good results.
Really professional, and I like this kind of approach to many years, because he's still young, and if you start like this, that means you can go forward.
If I have the legs and if I'm good, I want to win races, and it doesn't matter which one it is, even if it's a small one.
I really like his mentality, how he's kind of easy in a way, because he really focus on training and really prepare.
Terzo ponte. Quello fatto di rosso?
Probably the passion is what push us to suffer on the bike. I like to think about life, because everything is connected. I like to think that it's not easy to do something like really focus and really straight on one thing. We have to be more open.
Everybody's just motivated. Everybody wants to help each other, sacrifice maybe himself sometimes to get it back the next day.
We are always pushing all the worries in the one direction, always so focused on things, but slow down a bit, take a rest, and then again.
But it's not so painful then?
We are working in every small detail. Like if there's something what has to be improved, everybody just tries to improve themselves and the team, and I think that's unique, that's special, and
we grow and we build ourselves, and we build our career and our lifestyle, because at the end is a kind of lifestyle. Our life is not normal. We live in a bowl. We really it's sport, and cycling is really special.
BORA hansgrohe, I think we don't think we are at the end of our journey. We are just developing, so we want to be better, and we want to be the best World Tour team in the world.